Please welcome David Sloan Wilson.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very, very much. It is an honor to give the opening talk at this important conference. So, Albert Einstein was a wise man, and one of the things he said is that it is the theory that decides what we can observe. And I think that what Einstein meant by this is that we're a highly cultural species. Unlike other species whose behavior is largely genetically determined, our behavior is largely determined by our beliefs and ideas. And these determine what we attend to, literally what we see and hear, how we process that information, and ultimately how we act. And this is true not only for theories, but also for religions, political ideologies, and worldviews of all sorts. Now, one worldview has had an outsized influence on our lives. It began in the 19th century. After World War II, it was a minority position. But then it became enormously influential, thanks largely to heads of state such as Reagan and Thatcher, and hence its name, the orthodox model, and its conception of human nature, which is often described as Homo economicus, as if a description of a biological species. And Homo economicus is entirely self-regarding, is only interested in itself, without regard to the preferences of others. It is infinitely far-seeing and weighing its options far, far into the future. It exists in an economic world which is at equilibrium, which means that if you imagine a ball inside a bowl, that ball is always resting at the bottom of the bowl. In this world, there needs to be free markets, basically, to allow individual choice to operate itself. And when that happens, then what's good for the individual is also good for the common good. Free markets are required for this, and so regulations, no matter how well-meaning, interfere with the pursuit of self-interest and the welfare of society. And so this worldview has become part of the air that we all breathe. It's reflected in the metaphor of the invisible hand, the idea that society can function well without anyone in the society having its welfare in mind. And the ecologist Garrett Hardin, who coined the term the tragedy of the commons over a half-century ago, had this very perceptive thing to say. He said that actually the invisible hand was a very small part of Adam Smith's work. And few professional economists would actually say that in its simple form, the invisible hand concept is correct. But nevertheless, all of this has contributed to a dominant tendency to assume that decisions reached individually will, in fact, be the best decisions for an entire society. Hardin said that in 1968, and I think that's just as true, maybe even more true today in terms of the influence of this worldview. We have an entire edifice of mathematical equations which seem to lead to the conclusion that laissez-faire leads to the common good, and that we can prove this as if it were a geometrical proof or one of Newton's laws of motion. We have more theories which seem to lead to the conclusion that the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And of course, we have the infamous statement by Margaret Thatcher, then head of state of a very large society known as Great Britain, saying there is no such thing as society, only individuals and families. Now, when the economic crisis hit in 2008, the architects of the orthodox worldview were dumbfounded. And Alan Greenspan, who had been implementing the orthodox worldview over decades in the United States, said, those of us who have looked to self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself included, are in a state of shocked disbelief. And of course, all of us know about income inequality and in the United States, and to a lesser extent in Norway. So we all know that something is wrong. We all know that something needs to be done. The question, of course, is what? And for any worldview, when it's not working, there is a tendency to redouble efforts, try harder, and basically perhaps to dig the hole deeper. And of course, the other possibility is to let's consider another worldview. If one worldview isn't working, then let's very seriously consider another worldview. And that worldview is often portrayed as Homo sapiens, not Homo economicus. Let's abandon this fictional conception of human nature and try to build a worldview which is actually more in tune with the way people actually are. And so who is Homo sapiens? Who are we as a species? We are both self and other-oriented. We are genuinely interested in helping others and society as a whole, but of course we also have our self-interest. We are not infinitely far-seeing. We're fallible. We are driven by emotions and intuitions, and these evolved by a very complex process of genetic and cultural evolution. Economic systems are not always in equilibrium. In fact, they're seldom in equilibrium. As instead of a ball that's resting at the bottom of a bowl, it's a ball that's swirling around the sides of the bowl and maybe even hopping outside the bowl into another bowl. It is not the case that self-interest always leads to the common good. Sometimes that's true, but in many, many cases, what I do in my pursuit of self-interest will be at the expense of yours or at the society as a whole. Market processes are important, and more generally, self-organizing processes are important, but they need to be refereed. Every sports competition needs to be refereed, and so, of course, that should be the case for other competitive processes. And regulations are required for any living process. At the same time, a regulation is like a mutation. For every one that's beneficial, there's 100 that are detrimental. And so, of course, there's regulations that don't work, but the idea that there should be no regulations makes no sense at all for any living system. And so when we pursue these ideas, what we come to is a worldview that is centered on evolution, as stated by this man here, the economist Robert Frank, who made this bold prediction in 2011. He said basically a century from now, when economists are asked to identify the intellectual father of their discipline, a majority will name Charles Darwin. Now, this sounds strange to most people, very strange. You know, in America, we have this terrible problem that over half of Americans don't believe in evolution at all. And in Norway, that's not so much of a problem. I imagine everyone in this room is happy with evolution. But even in Norway and around the world, even those that do accept Darwin's theory of evolution, more or less associate it with genetic evolution, with dinosaurs, with fossils, with human origins, with DNA. And they don't know how that might apply to the fast-paced changes that are taking place all around us, the kind of issues that we are gathered here today to consider. What might that have to do with evolution? And so the reason for that disconnect is because there's more to evolution than genetic evolution. And this is something that the evolutionists themselves have only been studying over the last 30 or so years. There's more to evolution than genetic evolution. Indeed, we have a capacity for open-ended change. We are capable of changing as individuals and as societies, but our capacity to do that is a product of genetic evolution. So we need to tell a genetic evolutionary story in order to explain why we have this open-ended capacity for change. And this capacity is itself an evolutionary process. And so when we contemplate the fast-paced changes that are taking place all around us, including the changes that we wish was not occurring, and the positive changes that we would like to implement, then this is not some suspension of evolution. This is evolution operating in warp drive. Now, another reason why we tend not to associate evolution with public policy is because there's a very sad and tragic history in the past in which evolutionary theory has been used to justify social inequality and ruthless competition, the very ideas that are associated with the orthodox view. And so what we have to emphasize here is that the modern application of evolutionary theory to public policy is not at all like this. Instead, in just the same way that biologists use the same theory to study all aspects of all species, we actually have a theory that we can use to help discover positive change in virtually all major public policy issues. And this is important all by itself, because one thing about the world of public policy is that it's highly fragmented. Every different problem has a different community of people that are trying to solve that problem. And if we could have a single theory that could be brought to bear to address all of these problems, then that would be an enormous advance all by itself. And that's what the Evolution Institute that I preside over, and which has been in existence for about 5 years, strives to do. So how can this evolutionary worldview be put to use for the issues that you have come here to discuss? Here's a preview of the talks at this conference. So we have the issues of trusting and acknowledging the skills of workers. Above all, of letting workers make their own decisions, the toxic effects of cheap labor and illegal activities. How free choice, which would seem to be a good thing in the context of choosing schools, actually can lead to a pathological outcome of segregation. The cost of maintaining social welfare, and the merits of reducing working hours as one of the social benefits. These issues reflect more major policy goals of Manifest Analyze. What do we do about economic inequality? What do we do about public services versus privatization? What do we do about having solidarity in the face of immigrant labor and such things as right-wing extremism and fear of Muslims? Who is us and who is them? And so what I want to do for the rest of my talk is to try to make a connection between the evolutionary worldview and these issues. And this is going to be a little bit like skydiving. There's much to talk about. I can only touch upon them here. But so I'm going to highlight the following issues. First is the concept of prosociality, anything that's oriented towards the welfare of others and society as a whole. This is a key master variable. It's not the case that we need to center things on self-interest. We need to center things on prosociality. This is a multi-level process because society is multi-level, everything from little groups all the way to nations existing in the global village. Humans are a highly cooperative species. We evolved to be highly cooperative. Teamwork is the signature adaptation of our species, as I will show. And this can help us inform what is it needed for a group to work well? What are the design features? What does a group need to have in order to work well? And how does this work best in small groups? And how can groups then be combined into large-scale society? And finally, what is the status of Norway as a member of the global village? Does it provide an example, or can it even become part of the problem, perhaps, thriving as a nation, but not necessarily a solid citizen in the global village? Okay. So prosociality is any attitude, behavior, or institution that is oriented towards others or the welfare of others or society as a whole. It's a useful word. It includes cooperation, it includes altruism, but altruism is a funny word because altruism, of course, is a desire to help others, but there's also an expectation that this is self-sacrificial. So in order to help others, it must be costly for yourself. And pro-social is agnostic about that. If you can help others and benefit yourself at the same time, so much the better. That remains pro-social. And it turns out that a lot of research is demonstrating that prosociality is a kind of a master variable. If you live in a highly prosocial environment, you have multiple assets. You thrive in most respects, and society thrives in most respects. If you lack prosociality, then you have multiple liabilities. And so if there could be a single policy prescription, it would be to increase the incidence of prosociality. Now, if prosociality is so good, why is it often difficult to achieve? And there's a very fundamental reason why that is the case. Almost by definition, for us to help each other requires time, energy, and risk on the part of individuals. And these activities are inherently vulnerable to more self-serving activities that benefit individuals or factions at the expense of their groups. And this is a problem at all rungs of a multi-level social hierarchy. What's good for me can be bad for my family. What's good for my family can be bad for my clan. What's good for my clan can be bad for my nation. What's good for my nation can be bad for the global village. What's good for a corporation can be bad for the global economy. At every rung, we have this fundamental problem and this fundamental trade-off that what we must do to succeed as a society at this scale is vulnerable to being undermined by more self-serving activities within the same group. And this is not just a human problem, this is a biological problem. This is a problem that's faced with all social species. This is the problem that I have been studying as an evolutionary biologist for over 40 years. And so perhaps you can see why it is that a theory that has become very sophisticated within the biological sciences can have enormous relevance when we apply it to the realm of human life and contemporary affairs. And what we can say from a biological perspective, when we think about how is it that our species evolved and became so different from all other primate species, it is precisely because we became so cooperative. And the way that we became cooperative is because we evolved the ability to suppress self-serving behaviors within our group. So it was no longer possible, or I should say, no longer easy, to benefit oneself at the expense of others within one's own group. That option was more or less foreclosed. And so therefore, the main force of evolution was groups doing better than other groups. And our ancestors basically evolved to engage in teamwork. Teamwork is the signature adaptation of our species. And all of this evolved in the context of small groups. All groups were small groups up until about 10 or 15,000 years ago. And this theory enables us to delineate in considerable detail what is required for a group to function well. A key person here is Elinor Ostrom, who is a political scientist who won the Nobel Prize in 2009. And what she did was she studied groups around the world that attempt to manage common resources, such as this picture of an irrigation system on the island of Bali. And what she showed was that these groups were actually very successful at managing their own affairs, avoiding the tragedy of the commons, but only if they had certain design features. And these design features can be generalized to all of our groups. And when I go down the list, when you review this list, I'd like you to keep two things in mind. Number one, they're all familiar. There's really going to be no surprises in this list. But number two, think of the groups that you're involved in, large and small, and ask yourself the question, in how many cases do groups actually have these design features? And if they don't, might that be the reason that those groups don't function very well? So the first thing that a group needs to function well is a strong identity and sense of purpose. We need to know who is our group, what is our group, who's in it, what are we here to do? And if you don't have that, then your group is unlikely to work well. Second, there must be an equitable distribution of costs and benefits. It cannot be the case that some people do most of the work and other people get the benefits. It doesn't have to be even, but basically your benefits should be proportional to your effort. Otherwise, the group is not sustainable. Decision-making has to be fair. That might be by consensus, or if that's too cumbersome, it has to be by some other process that's recognized as fair by members of the group. There has to be monitoring. There has to be a sense in which there's acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior, and we have to know, we have to be able to tell the difference. If anyone misbehaves, there has to be a way to correct that, and that need not be harsh. In fact, in the groups that function best, then Most people are eager to operate in solid citizen mode, and if they don't, they're eager for friendly reminder is sufficient. But then, of course, there's some individuals that are not like that, and stronger sanctions are required for those situations. There has to be fast, fair conflict resolution. In any group, there will be conflicts, and there must be a way to resolve those conflicts in a way that's regarded as fair by all parties, and it must be a relatively rapid process. The group must have autonomy, discretion, elbow room to govern its own affairs, because if they're being dictated from above, then of course they can't do all those other things. And then in a multi-group society, then there must be relationships among those groups which more or less embody the same relationships among individuals within groups. And so this provides a little bit of a recipe or a how-to guide for how to construct a group. And these ingredients are easiest to achieve in small groups. I've already said that for most of our evolutionary history, all groups were small. And so all of our psychological traits evolved in the context of these small groups. The great French theorist Alexis de Tocqueville, who visited America in the 19th century and wrote Democracy in America, also had this a very perceptive thing to say about small groups. He said the village or township is the only association which is so perfectly natural that it seems to constitute itself. Small groups seem to hum along, at least if they have these ingredients. When groups become bigger, then the same ingredients are needed, but they are harder to achieve. And so what that means is that if something can be done in a small group, it probably should be. Large-scale society should be multi-cellular. And then when we think of how we want to construct larger society, a concept called polycentric governance, which is also part of what Elinor Ostrom contributed, is important. And very simply, what it says is this: life consists of many spheres of activity. Each activity has an appropriate scale. And so governance must consist of finding the optimal scale for each sphere and then appropriately coordinating among scales. When we state it like that, it seems that it can't be otherwise, and yet how many large-scale societies are actually constructed like this? And so the next step that we have to consider is, how do we understand large-scale societies? We're not genetically adapted to live in large-scale societies. When agriculture developed and all of a sudden human groups became larger, they more or less outstripped our ability to have all these ingredients. It became more difficult to know what the group was, for example. Monitoring became more difficult. Sanctions became more difficult. Everything became more difficult. And the only reason that societies hang together at these scales is because of products of cultural evolution, cultural inventions basically, which interface with our innate psychology in order for groups to function at a larger scale. And every large-scale society around the world is an example of cultural evolution, with tremendous differences among societies and nations in how well they implement these design principles. And here's just 4 books which are now leading to this conclusion, basically, this worldview of how we're to understand large-scale society as a product of evolution. So it means that we really cannot understand how a society works without a detailed understanding of its cultural history. And this, again, is very different from the orthodox worldview, which is, for the most part, ahistorical. Here's a graph from the Spirit Level, a very, very important book that I know is well known, and many of you probably know about this book, but all of you should know about it, and all of you should read it. What the graph is a comparison of developed nations on the x-axis from income inequality, from low, so equal societies on the left, to unequal societies on the right. And on the y-axis is a measure of social welfare. And the book shows graph after graph after graph, which demonstrates that inequality is toxic to social welfare. For just about every measure of social welfare that you can think of, we have this relationship in which the more unequal the society, then the more social problems there are. I'm sad to say that my own nation of the United States is leading the world in inequality. It's way up there on the top of that graph. And Norway, along with other Scandinavian nations and nations such as Japan and Switzerland, are anchoring the other end of the distribution among the most equal of nations. Although, of course, all of these things are changing. Now, one of the things that Wilkinson and Pickett do in the spirit level is they take the United States way up there in that top corner, leading the world in inequality. And then they open it up and they study the 50 states within the United States. And when you do that, what you find is all of the same trends are occurring. The 50 states vary in their equality. And there is the same relationship with social welfare. And down at the bottom of that curve are the states that were colonized by Norwegians and other Scandinavians, such as Minnesota. It's almost as if it's like a natural experiment where you take a culture and you transplant it to someplace else, and they carry on the way they were, and it's all taking place there. If you wonder, is it true that Norway is just unique, it can't take place elsewhere? This is actually saying it can, because a transplant experiment has been done. And this is also showing you how fractal these processes are, how we have a single set of principles that apply to all scales, from the smallest of groups to the largest of nations. We need social equality. And so that brings us to the significance of the Nordic model, the new supermodel. And of course, you don't need me to tell you that Norway is under the spotlight, basically, under the microscope, as something which is working well. And the whole world wants to know, why is Norway working well? And that's not to say it's working perfectly. So of course it's not. No society does. And of course, this might be due to circumstances. Isn't it lucky that you have extensive oil reserve? But that's not what it's entirely due to. It's due to your social organization. And so we really want to know, what is that social organization? What can be copied? What can be emulated? What can't? And I think that the evolutionary worldview is going to be very successful at unpacking the Nordic model. That's something that I'm very interested in doing. But the fact that things are working well now is no guide to the future. And this amazing graph here summarizes 200 years of American history, from 1800 to 2000. It was compiled by Peter Turchin, who is the vice president of the Evolution Institute. And what we see here in the purple is an index of inequality, and we see in the blue is an index of well-being. And you can see how tightly these are correlated with each other. Just as we saw in a comparison of nations, this relationship between equality and social welfare, if you take a single nation, over time, you find the same relationship, basically. And if you go down to the bottom of the curve, which is what's happening now, what we see is we have a rapid increase in inequality and a rapid decrease in well-being. Who would want to emulate the United States of America at this point in its history? And wouldn't it be interesting to compile a similar graph for Norway to see what its relationship is? And wouldn't it be interesting to show that Norway perhaps is perched like a roller coaster on top of a peak, just about to head down into a valley? What if the graph were to show that? Well, here is an image of a turbulent future. It is from a movie that appeared a couple years ago about the Wizard of Oz. And in the earlier movie of the Wizard of Oz, you might remember if you saw it way back, that at the very end of the movie, Dorothy and the wizard are going to go back in their balloon. They're going to go back to Kansas, but the balloon takes off before Dorothy can get in it. And Dorothy calls out to the wizard, "Come back!" And the wizard calls back to Dorothy, "I can't. I don't know how it works." And I think that stands for all of us. All of us are living in a social balloon that's paradoxically of our own making, and yet we don't understand how it works. No politician, no economist, and no scientist, including myself or any of my colleagues who are newly employing the evolutionary worldview, knows how any of this works. That's how great our uncertainty is. But I do know that it is the worldview that determines what we can see. I think we do know that much. And I think it's possible that the orthodox worldview will never enable us to solve the problems of modern human existence. If that's our lens through which we see the world, then we will never understand it well enough. And all of our attempts to make things better will actually make things worse. And the evolutionary worldview, while new, I think it has tremendous potential, in part because it has such a strong scientific foundation. A theory that's become very sophisticated within the biological sciences is now newly being applied to all aspects of public policy, and also because in the short time that we've been using it, we've have insights and results that have already been delivered. So I thank you very much for your attention.